Okay, guys, we're getting started here, continuing our conversation on, well, maybe starting it on our talk about government spending. And so, you answered these questions back on Monday, and, it was interesting to see you guys' thoughts. And so, there's obviously going to be a reason we talk about these things. In actuality, these programs that we talked about or that you talked about on Monday, um, they all exist and they all are challenges that our economy faces, and they're all going to be the biggest spending programs that our government is responsible for. So, just a couple things as we kind of get into this. Let's understand that as our government moves into the future and into situations where they seem like they feel like they should provide more stuff, okay, for people. Their spending is increasing, okay, and they do more than they ever have before here in the United States. And so, the challenge is, how do they pay for it? Okay, and we're going to talk about that as we move forward. Just a quick little brief history of our government spending. Um, First of all, our government, remember, is it was extremely hands off. You've heard the term laissez faire before, hands off. The government's not going to do anything, and so if you look at the percentage of how much the government was spending through basically up to the Civil War, and then even after the Civil War, once things got back to normal or whatever, when the war wasn't going on, right? The government didn't do anything. They just stayed out of people's business. Now, that unregulated capitalism led to some problems, some monopoly problems, most specifically speaking economically, as well as workers being taken advantage of due to such a large supply of labor, immigrant wise, especially from Europe at the time in the early 1900s, right? And so in 1932, something um, you know, changes significantly, and we elect FDR into office, okay, during the Great Depression. Well, FDR starts a whole bunch of programs, like Social Security, unemployment insurance, even like things that we would say like, oh, I can't believe that didn't exist before, like orphanages sponsored by the government, and a whole lot of different types of social programs that people could benefit from. Okay, which at the end of the day is probably in one way, shape, or form getting money to when they can't get it themselves, right? And so, anyway, we see that big change. The big change after World War II was, we started funding a military full time. And so that was a big spending change. And then into the 60s and 70s, you see a change in um, basically how we have or how we conducted ourselves in welfare systems. And so they call it the redistribution of income. If you've studied some U.S. history, Lyndon B. Johnson called it the Great Society, and they talked about taxing high income Americans and redistributing that income towards lower income Americans. And so, again, it's another thing the government does. Again, I think a lot of us, in a lot of cases with these programs, we're going to say, hey, listen, that seems like a pretty smart thing to do. Are there going to be challenges? Absolutely. People take advantage of the programs, right? It lowers incentives sometimes to obviously find jobs in some cases. But understand that before the 1930s, the welfare programs that we know today, the social programs that we know today did not exist. Okay. And so that's the big change. And as we move further into the future, we add programs rather than take them away. Right. And so anyway, let's get through these programs here pretty quick, and give us some definitions. And so here's the big challenge as our government does these things, okay, and provides this stuff. We're not going to complain about how much money they spend. The challenge is going to be, okay, how much money do they spend compared to how much they collect? Okay. Before this whole coronavirus thing and the stimulus programs, we were planning on overspending by about $1 trillion in the year 2020, and that's going to change significantly because we've got some problems with the COVID stuff. Not only is the government distributing money as a stimulus, the government's not collecting nearly as much money from income tax, and so that's going to be an extreme economic challenge as we continue to move forward. Um, and our debt right now is somewhere in the range of about 24, almost $25 trillion. So here's our number. Okay. I don't know how up to date this is with some of the with some of the most recent stimulus programs, which not necessarily important to have this down to the dollar, right? But either way, the number that becomes important is when the government decides that they have to borrow money, which when they overspend, they borrow money just like you and I do from banks. All right. When they decide to do that, well, they've got to pay interest on that. And right now we're planning to pay about $380 billion in interest payments alone in this year. Okay. And so, those numbers are extremely large and extremely challenging. Again, when you think about, oh my gosh, we're overspending by that much, where else could that money be spent? Well, we could spend it on a whole bunch of different things. We don't necessarily need to. I mean, you could come up with whatever you want, right? If we broke it down by states, if every state got an equal amount of money, that's $8 billion per state, right? And I know they break things down based on population, but average, that's going to be almost $8 billion per state. What could the state of Indiana do with $8 billion, right? And so whether it's improve education, improve roads, improve all those different things that the government could help provide us, right? And so that's the challenge. That's going to be the conversation kind of moving forward, I think, into especially into November when this presidential election gets going a little bit, and how are we going to deal with some of this debt? So anyway, let's look at the programs that are the biggest spending programs. All right. So skipping through some stuff here, you've already seen some of these programs. And if you read them closely when you did that writing assignment back in January, you saw the stats, right? So Social Security, Medicare, okay, care for old people. Medicaid is for low income people. Medicare and Social Security are the biggest spending, okay? And if our government's going to spend about $4 trillion a year, okay, Medicare plus Social Security is about 45% of that. Okay, so 45% of that $4 trillion is being spent on people over 65 years old. All right, for the most part. Okay, I've got to do certain things to qualify. And anyway, I'll let you read through these. So if you need to pause it on them or whatever, read through them. But here's the challenge: if we're going to save money, we're going to have to cut spending from our most expensive stuff. If you guys have ever tried to save money, like, oh my gosh, I'm spending so much money, like, okay, let's say that, for me, it would be on my mortgage payment or even a car payment, maybe, like where I could save a whole bunch of money. Well, I don't really want to necessarily move into an even smaller house with my 3 young children that drive me crazy, right? So I can't cut money from that. I have to have that. My car, obviously, I've got to get from point A to point B. Those are my electricity bills, my internet bill, maybe even to a point. And so maybe eventually I get to the point where I say, okay, I'm going to stop eating fast food, the one time a week that I eat fast food. All right. So you get fast food once a week and, maybe you spend $8 every time you go. All right. So if I cut it out for an entire month, $8 a week, I'm saving $32 a month, right? A very, very small portion of income. Okay. And so it's hard to cut the things that are necessities. All right. And we'll talk about how these are laws a little bit later on. To change this law, okay, if I qualify for it, the government has to pay me. If they don't have any money, they got to borrow it to pay me for these programs. Okay, it's set by law, which means if I'm going to change these laws, that it has to go through Congress. All right, the House has to vote on it, the Senate has to vote on it, the President has to vote on it, and so extremely challenging to do with how politicized things are becoming in the United States today. And on top of that, too, let's just say that I was running for president and saying, hey, listen, we spend too much money. We're going to cut Social Security payments. All right. Well, if I cut Social Security payments, there's a couple problems with that. Number one is it's going to increase the amount of money in old people's pockets, which means that they are going to obviously spend less. Okay. It's also going to mean that I've got to get elected. Well, guess what population votes the most often? Senior citizens vote the most often. Okay. And so if I'm a politician, I'm not a very good politician if I can't get elected. Okay. And so that plays a role too, as far as why we don't change some of these things. 6.2% of your paycheck goes towards social security tax. 1.45% of your paychecks goes towards Medicare tax. Um, Unemployment insurance, this number is going to go up at a very high rate in 2000 and I'm sorry, this number in 2019. You can see how big it was in 2010 when our unemployment rate was at 10%. Okay. Some people say that it's going to be way worse as we move forward. All righty. Um, Medicaid, again, this is based on how much income you collect, and how much you pay is based on that. So like somebody that earns, for example, $50,000 a year, they might have to pay, and it depends on how many kids you have too. So they might have to pay, 70% of their bill, whereas someone that makes $10,000 a year, maybe they only have to pay 10% of their bill. So it's prorated in terms of what your income is. We also have military and defense spending. We spend a whole lot of money on that as well. All right, if you kind of chunk these out a little bit, you can see the biggest in form of a pie chart in terms of what we spend our money on. This yellow stuff we're going to get into on Friday and talk about the differences between the blue and the yellow, okay, and how they're set by law and or not set by law. And so that'll make a little bit more sense at that time too. Okay, so for your assignment for today, another pretty quick one, but I like hearing you guys' opinions, and you guys are doing good jobs with it. All right, so here is your question on this slide here. All righty. Basically, our government has three options. If this debt is a big deal, all right, which some people are going to say it's a big deal, some people are going to say it's not as big of a deal as people make it out to believe. Should we keep the government spending at its current rates and go further into debt? Right, so that's option A. Do we reduce government spending, okay, to eliminate some of this debt, okay? Or do we raise taxes to be able to keep government spending at its current rates? Alrighty, now I asked this question obviously last year before the COVID stuff has obviously occurred, but obviously that's going to play a role too. Does the government continue to operate as they need to as we get through this COVID stuff? It might complicate it. So I want to make sure that you answer the question. All right, what you think. And I know you've answered it once throughout the government spending assignment. Some of you haven't done it. So anyway, make sure that you do it. I'm interested to see your thoughts. Give me, 2 or 3 sentences is all you need after you give me your option. And on Friday, we're going to finish these out, and we will talk about taxes, okay, and how much we pay in taxes. All of a sudden, we're down to, I believe, 3 weeks of class after Friday. So like 10 more class periods. So that's kind of exciting. Keep it up, keep getting stuff turned in. I will go through these slides for you to be able to pause them as you want to read about them, to especially if you are needing an explanation as to why you're doing things. All right, we will see you guys on Friday.